I'm going to be bringing up our reading panel. We've got a stellar group of renowned reading experts who are going to come and shed some light on the question of how, why, what's behind the NAEP reading scores staying relatively flat throughout the entire trend. The panel will be moderated by Sue Pimentel, a standards and curriculum specialist and founding partner of both Student Achievement Partners and Standards Work Incorporated. In addition, she is our former vice chair of the governing board. Let's welcome Sue and her panelists to the stage.
Thank you, Tonya. We have an august panel here today, and I'm just going to do the briefest of introductions so you can situate who's who on the panel, and then we'll get started. So first we have Marilyn Adams. She's a visiting scholar, as you can see up there, from Brown. Conversations about beginning reading, about reading difficulties in young students and avoiding those. You just don't do anything with that unless you've read her scholarly works. And if you are a school system that's having trouble, you call Marilyn. So, and just to give you a little color, she's been a long advisor of NAEP reading panels, and she has advised Sesame Street. How many of us remember Sesame Street? From at least our kids, at least in my instance, it's my kids. So then we have Ian Rowe. Ian Rowe is CEO of the Public Prep Charter School Network. Interestingly, they are single-sex elementary and middle school that they're dedicated to getting their students in good high schools and then into college. And just to give you some sense of Ian's long role in the public sector, he had MTV. He worked for MTV, something called Get Schooled, was so international. In addition to domestic, which is really his focus has a long time been on increasing the college completion rates of low-income students, which we've heard some about today. Tim Shanahan, who doesn't know Tim, right? So Tim is a distinguished professor emeritus from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Did I get it right? Did I do it? So Tim has been all about improving reading achievement throughout his distinguished career. So the connection between reading and writing, disciplinary literacy. He's actually in the Reading Hall of Fame, in fact. And he has over 200 publications. If you have not had the pleasure of reading one of Tim's pieces, please do. They are oftentimes hard-hitting, they are tough, but they are also a delight to read. So check out that. And then we have Dan Willingham, professor of psychology at University of Virginia. Dan applies sort of cognitive psychology to K-12 and beyond in education. Dan's thinking, his research, his writings are in demand around the world. As a matter of fact, his writings have been translated into 15 languages. So with that, Carol Jago, who's a member of the governing board, and a reading expert, national reading expert, an all-around good person, is going to jumpstart us by giving us a brief message.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us to discuss the NAEP reading results for 2017. I'm Carol Jago, a member of the National Assessment Governing Board and the Associate Director of the California Reading and Literature Project at UCLA. Unfortunately, I'm unable to be with you today in person, but I'm very much with you in spirit. We've put together a panel of distinguished guests for what I know will be a stimulating discussion to probe the nation's stubbornly flat results on reading assessments. As a longtime high school English teacher and the past president of the National Council of Teachers of English, this is something I've thought about a great deal. I believe that if we're to see significantly improved reading scores, we as a society will need to foster a culture that values reading. It isn't just a decision between more books or more screens, more direct instruction or more accountability, more time to read or more time on task. It's all of the above and more. Rather than pointing fingers to assign blame, we would do well to look in the mirror. How much do we model the habit of reading that we hope students will develop? How often do we acknowledge how much our own thinking owes to the books we've read and the texts we continue to read? To a large extent, achievement is driven by interest. What have you done lately to interest young people in reading? How many books have you put in children's hands? How often do you yourself get caught reading? Too many of our children are not reading enough to become good readers. If we put our minds and resources to helping them do so, higher test scores will follow. Thank you for your interest. And now I'll turn this discussion over to our panelists for their insights into this vexing situation.
So thank you to Carol. So we really want to focus our discussion today on what needs to happen. So Carol said the results are stubbornly flat. Yes, they've inched up a tiny bit over the years, but we have little more than a third of our students reading at the proficient level or above. We need 2/3, we need 3/4, we need all of our students reading at that level so they can set themselves up for success. We heard from Glenn today who said teachers want to excel. Of course they do. Teachers are working hard, students are working hard. But what are we not doing that we need to do to improve reading achievement? What are we doing that perhaps we need to do less of so we improve reading achievement in our students? So I'm going to turn to our panel, and I would like each of you, Carol says reading more is really important, and we all have a role to play. So based on your vast experience, expertise, and research, can you each speak to how does curriculum and instruction need to change to improve reading achievement? And in your words, Dr. Willingham, you talk about raising students who read. So what needs to change so that we raise kids who can read? Can you start us off?
Absolutely. So there's no doubt that we are in a reading plateau. And in thinking about how to get out of it, how to improve student reading across the board, I want to draw everyone's attention to a finding from reading researchers that's about 25 years old now. What reading researchers found a couple decades ago is that once kids are fluent decoders, a key determinant of comprehension, perhaps the key determinant of comprehension, is what kids know about the topic of the text that they're about to read. So in other words, if I'm going to read a text about whales or the Titanic, a key determinant of my comprehension of that text is what I already know about whales or the Titanic, which sounds a little strange initially because we think of reading as the way we're going to learn something new. So it sounds like we're saying, well, if you want to learn something about whales, read this text, but by the way, you already need to know something about whales if you're going to understand it. But it's actually not that strange. It's actually baked into the way communication works. When we communicate, whether communication is written or spoken, we omit information that we think our audience already knows. So for example, in the course of a conversation, I might say to you, you know, that puppy I got is really cute, but I wish I had thought about putting new carpets down before I got this new puppy. You might have no difficulty understanding this. You see, right, new carpets, new puppy, Dan's a little distressed about this situation. But when you analyze it, like, I didn't give you critical information you needed to really comprehend my communication to you. I didn't say anything about the fact that puppies ruin new carpets. I didn't say that carpets are expensive and difficult to replace. I just assumed that you knew it. And the reason I omit that information is that if I laboriously included all that information that you already know, I would be an extremely boring person to listen to. Everybody knows a few people like that, who sort of tells you a little bit more than you actually need to know. But most people don't, and writers don't do that either. Writers omit information that they figure their audience already knows. So what happens if you pick up a text, the writer has assumed certain knowledge on your part, and you don't have it? Well, the consequences are pretty obvious. You're not going to understand the text. You're either going to be confused or you're going to think that you understand it, but you're actually missing important nuances in the text. So this is why 25 years ago, reading researchers found that when you take what we would consider to be a good general reader, somebody who can pick up the Washington Post and read most any article they find there with pretty good comprehension, that type of reader has very broad general knowledge, because any article they pick up, they know at least a little something about the topic or something closely related to the topic. So when I think about getting out of this plateau and boosting reading comprehension for our students, what I think about is how are we going to ensure that all of our students have that type of broad knowledge that will allow them to tackle any text that they encounter? And specifically, how are we going to ensure that every student is exposed to a curriculum that is knowledge-rich and appropriately sequenced so that they will gain that knowledge?
Thanks. Ian, how about you go next?
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. As Susan said, I run Public Prep, which is a network in New York City. We have about 2,000 girls and boys across our 6 campuses in the heart of the South Bronx and Lower East Side of Manhattan, mostly low-income kids. And I'm very proud to say that our first graduating class had graduated from 8th grade back in 2013. 90% of them are now in their first year of college, schools like Yale, Howard, Skidmore, and some of the best colleges and universities in the country. So very excited about that. But as proud as we are around college acceptances, what really keeps us up at night are really the early literacy outcomes, particularly in grades pre-K through 2, even before we get to the high-stakes testing grades in 3, 4, and up, because frankly, that's where the foundation is really built and probably explains much of why we're not seeing the outcomes we want in 4th, 8th, and 12th grade and beyond. Put simply, our kids weren't born in 4th grade, right? So we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we strengthen the foundation from which we grow. And we are continuously in this process of doing what Dan has described, to build a knowledge-based curriculum. This idea of creating grade-by-grade expectations that is designed in a coherent and cumulative fashion to build towards a defined body of knowledge. Because ultimately, content matters a lot. Content-rich materials, those need to become the vehicle through which we learn all of the reading skills that we want our kids to develop. So I remember a couple years ago, one of our 6th graders on some test, assessment we were doing, was afterwards expressed a lot of frustration because she had difficulty accessing a particular text. And I said, why? And she said, I couldn't understand it. There was this word, rugby. Like, rugby? What is that? She said, I don't know. That's why I had difficulty accessing the text. I said, how do you spell that? And she said, Rugby. And so for her, encountering that word was just not in a context, and it just suddenly made everything else in the text much more difficult to access, right? And so this is not an argument necessarily for us to be teaching Australian rules football, but it does highlight what I think Dan's point is, that access to background knowledge, a broad base of background knowledge, helps in empowering our students to be able to access much larger bodies of content. The other thing that's important, so it's not only the content-rich information, but also the intellectual preparation of teachers. So we can't expect kids to do close reading of complex texts if our faculty haven't also first grappled with the content, understanding the nuances, and everything else that's involved in close reading.
All right. Tim, how about you go?
Okay. I'll try to build on what my colleagues have just shared with you. I don't disagree with any of what they've said. I think one of the barriers to accomplishing, say, what Dan described is, a belief system in our schools, a belief system that really is, at this stage, about 70 years in the making. Back in the 1940s, a reading guru had stated a theory. He believed that students would only be able to learn to read if they were put in easy enough texts that they would be able to read it with great facility. And even though that theory hadn't undergone any kind of tests or any kind of research, it really became the dominant way of teaching reading, and in fact it still is. And what that means for a substantial percentage of our kids is that if, say, you're a fourth grader and you read a little bit less well than the average fourth grader, you're probably going to be taught reading and perhaps science and social studies in a third grade book, or perhaps a second grade book if you're a bit lower. And throughout the grades we see this kind of thing. It's very, very, very popular. The majority of elementary teachers use it. Over the last couple of decades, there's been some interest in doing research on this to see what the effects are. And at best, this has no positive effects. It doesn't do anything for kids, holding them back like that. And at worst, it's been found to do real damage, that it's held kids back. I know I was giving a talk on this in Ohio a while back, and a young man, a high school student with learning disabilities, started cheering at some point when I was talking. And so when I got done, I wanted to know what was going on, went over to talk to him. And he said, well, the reason he was cheering was because what I was saying is that kids didn't need to be taught in the stupid books anymore. Because what was happening to him is, instead of getting those grade level science and social studies and so on, he was always given the easier stuff. What we need our kids to do, I certainly agree with Carol's point on the video that kids have to read more, and certainly read more within school, but they've got to read things that are demanding enough that they actually have to confront those barriers to understanding. And some of those are content barriers, and some of those are linguistic barriers. But you need to do that when there's somebody there, a teacher, who can actually guide you to make sense of the language. A simple example is kids learning to use the context to make sense of unknown vocabulary, or using the morphology of the words to make sense of the vocabulary. And in other cases, it might be figuring out how to untangle the complex grammar of a sentence, or being able to follow the cohesive links across a passage. Those aren't things that everybody just figures out on their own, and so having the guidance from a teacher when you're actually confronting difficult text is absolutely critical. And I think that if we would both increase the amounts of reading, and making sure that the reading that they're doing is focused on content, substantive content, absolutely, and with language complex enough that it really challenges kids to figure it out, I think you'd see better NAEP scores.
Thanks, Tim. Marilyn, you're up.
Thank you. Alongside, there's recently been a big shift in our understanding of cognitive development, of reading development, that has very strong implications for how we go about supporting reading development in our classrooms. So this is a little geeky, but it's important. So with your forbearance, I'm going there. Making sure that by grade 12, our kids' reading ability is strong enough for the more advanced texts of college and career is a paramount goal of schooling. They've given us that message, and beyond the basics, and of course, good basics are critically important. The way we've traditionally approached this goal is based on two core assumptions. One assumption is about how students learn. The other assumption is about what makes texts difficult. The core assumption about reading development is that it proceeds as a function of the number of times the different words in the text have been read before. The core assumption about text difficulty, or the readability of a text, is that it's a function of the text's average word frequency. That is, the average number of times that the student is likely to have seen the words of the text before in his lifetime or her lifetime. So importantly, these two assumptions are tightly interrelated in a way that translates directly into what is broadly or has broadly been deemed best practice. If text complexity grows from grade 1 through grade 12 through the introduction and practice of new words, layer by layer, then reading growth should be ensured. Reading growth should happen by ensuring that students conquer text leveled for each grade in turn, okay? Readying them for the next grade. So all of this is squarely based on 20th century learning theory. The more times you experience something, the more strongly it becomes represented in memory. And in all, it seems to make sense, it fits together, and as documented by Professor Shanahan, this framework is very broadly respected in our middle grades, especially in our middle grades and middle schools. So good, except not good, because there's a problem, and it's a great big problem. Recent work in the cognitive and neurosciences teaches us that the difficulty or readability of a text is not determined by the number of times the words within it have been read before by the student. Instead, the difficulty of a text is determined by the predictability of the words in text as you go through it. At a global level, there are two factors that affect a word's predictability. The first is the syntax or word flow of the text. United precedes states, like that. Does the word fit grammatically? The second, and extremely powerful predictor, turns out to be the number of different contexts in which the words of the text appear. And this works two ways. Let's say this is our target word. If the readers encountered this word before in similar context, then it's more predictable in this text, right? And conversely, when the word occurs, it in turn recalls the language and the content and the knowledge with which it has been associated, raising the predictability of other words, even while promoting the reader's interpretation and understanding. So this, in short, this research basically destroys the underpinnings of our traditional view of reading development. And alongside, it carries a number of strong instructional recommendations. Maybe most importantly is among the important things is that among the important things is that the very widespread practice of giving children easier texts when you witness belabored decoding or poor understanding. The newer frameworks argue strongly against this. Giving children easier texts when they're weaker readers serves to deny them the very language and information and modes of thought that they need to move up and on. They need to catch up and move on. Instead, this framework argues strongly that all of the reading material we give to every child should present a certain degree of challenge in one way or another. Learning is not the end goal of reading. There's a reciprocity between reading and learning, and it's a reciprocity that, as Inn has argued quite appropriately, should begin at the very outset of the children's education. To my mind, it's not coincidental that the nature and practical implications of the theoretical shift echo what Ian and Tim and Dan have been talking about in terms of research on increasing the efficacy for our reading research. But we also must bear in mind that destroying a theoretical framework does not translate easily, necessarily, into changing the practice that theoretical framework has spawned. And that's where we need to focus.
All right. I know we've got a few minutes left, but maybe we're going to have a little flex in the schedule, which I'm hoping for. So here's the deal. We heard research, 25 years old. We heard other research that's been around for decades. We've based a lot of our reading instruction on non-research. We've heard that foundational skills matter. They matter a lot. We've got to get kids reading, and we all know that about by the third grade. We've heard knowledge building is critical. We've heard that needs to move into content-rich curriculum. We heard that too, and that means also, while students need to read a whole series of texts, we get it, maybe in ranges of complexity, but to get to Dan's point about knowledge building, we are also hearing that in order for students to read well, they've got to read at grade level because that's where they're going to get the vocabulary they need, the syntax they need, and the concepts they need. So having said that, why aren't we doing it? And I don't know who would like to start. Ian, or you can say why you are doing it, if you'd like to say why you are doing it. And the challenge is really quickly in a minute or so.
So knowledge-based curriculum, I think most of us agree that is crucial. And as a practitioner now trying to do it, defining a body of knowledge sounds good, but you ultimately have to make decisions. You have to make decisions about what content is in and what content is out, right? What is culturally competent. For every decision that you choose for something that's in, there is some constituency that will fight for the inclusion of what is out, right? And what often happens is that the conflict that is created is so significant that folks just choose not to deal with it at all. So a choice is actually made, and that choice is not to define a body of knowledge. So then you have an incoherent set of content expectations that you're building, or in fact not building, grade by grade, and that is a crime. That is particularly for low-income kids that don't have access to a broad body of knowledge that will give them the kind of access. That lack of choice is extremely detrimental for our kids. And also, for example, in New York State, there used to be a New York State social studies exam. The absence of that then creates a perverse incentive to not teach as much social studies, right? You fill that time with more ELA, so suddenly social studies goes from 5 days a week to 2 days a week. It's those kinds of moves that create the apparatus that makes it a lot easier to make our curriculum more content-free zones.
Thanks. Who else would like to respond?
I'll jump in on this. A couple of us were hitting on how difficult the texts are. And we had the state panel up here earlier, and every one of the states and the Department of Defense schools are among the states that have essentially set text level standards, what it is that kids are supposed to be able to read by the end of the year. Not all the states have done that, but certainly a number of them have. I work in some of those states. I work in a number of other states around the country, and a real common kind of response when I go through what that standard means is teachers will say, that's not what it means. I teach 6th grade. This youngster's reading at a 5th grade level. The state doesn't mean we're supposed to teach those kids with a 6th grade book. And the question for them, of course, is if you're going to teach them with the 5th grade book, when do they get to read the 6th grade book? And you can follow that logic all the way through. If you're a youngster, if the kids in your community are low readers, whether that's because of poverty reasons, whether that's because of out-of-school issues, whether that's because the schools just aren't good enough, those kids never get a chance to catch up. They never get a chance to deal with the kind of rich content. And certainly taking away their social studies or science isn't going to help that at all.
Anybody else want to speak to it? Dan or Marilyn?
Sure, I'll add one thought. if you're going to try to build knowledge, as obviously I think is essential, you better be in it for the long haul, and you better be patient. There's a funny thing that happens with reading. When you look at kids who are, if you think our achievement in algebra is not what it ought to be, the expectation is not that you're going to get instant improvement the next year when you change course, because you recognize, well, knowledge in mathematics builds slowly, accumulates slowly, and so we're going to need to start changing things early and look for that knowledge to accumulate. And several years down the road, we hope that that will percolate up to algebra. Same thing is true in reading. You need, patience is absolutely essential.
Marilyn, do you want to-
Yeah, again, discouraging some of the practices that take time and aren't working is a challenge, always, in such a big system. But there's also the issue of making it easy and motivating the practices that are shown to make a difference. Our teachers need better material to work with. Don't you agree?
Yes.
Don't you agree? And they need to have a real understanding that it's not simply that it's so important. I mean, they know that it's so important that kids have to learn to read in order to be able to learn efficiently and productively. But we really have to help them understand that kids have to learn in order to be able to read efficiently and productively. And while we look at the teachers who we want them to love every day of the year and give them the tools they need to do that, we also must look at our schools of education. We need for our pre-service schools of education, for example, this problem that Tim talked about give them an easier text, I think is reviewed in nearly every book I've ever picked up that's given to pre-service reading teachers. If you want to change the schools of education in most states because of the fiscal and management structure of universities, you can't do it through you cannot do it through either the provost or the dean of the school. You will need to work hard and go to your legislature. It's a professional school, and we need for them to be as good as they can possibly be.
Terrific. So I'm just going to look for whether or not can I ask them just one more quick question, or is there can I ask them just one more really quick? So okay, here goes. Not everybody has to answer. So we've only had this wonderful half hour where I think we've learned a lot, but there may be other issues that deserve further conversation. Not for now, but do you just want to name them? Does anybody have one to name? Ian, you're looking like you do.
Well, yes. So this NAEP study, again, like all the others, continues to show there's this persistent racial achievement gap in reading, which continues to be troubling. But we always have to remember, we have to acknowledge that less than half of white students who are fourth graders are reading at proficiency, right? So, and in fact, the gap between fourth grade white students' proficiency and 100% is more than double the black-white achievement gap, right? So the idea is that poor reading performance crosses racial boundaries. And so we have to start looking at metrics that go beyond what explains these differences potentially within race. And I would strongly recommend, I've been writing essays about this, but I would strongly recommend that NAEP, College Board, other entities start looking at some out-of-school factors, in particular family structure. Family structure matters, and it matters a lot. Particularly, it's deeply correlated to things that we know that are important, such as student attendance, words heard at home. It is just a fact that the growth in non-marital birth rates, particularly to women and men aged 24 and under, have had a profound impact on the stability of home environments in which our children are raised. And that needs to become a metric by which we're looking at outcomes on par with race, class, and gender, because family structure is a force as fundamental to human development as all these other factors.
And so, of course, we can't do anything about the kids that come to us and the family structures they have, but I imagine in conversations with you at a later time, you're talking about how you're giving extra supports to students that then come in those family structures. So anybody else want to add anything that they want to make sure the issue gets on the table?
I'll add very quickly, just to circle back to the video we saw from Carol. I maybe speak for my fellow panel members when I say we're not anti-kids reading fun stuff at home, right? I mean, it's not either or, it's both and we want kids to be reading books for pleasure at home as well. But we also want them to be stretching themselves, especially in educational contexts.
Terrific. Anybody else? Tim, you good? Marilyn, you good?
Just one thing for you guys. Having said that giving kids an easier text is not promising, you still have the issue of making sure that you're not giving kids texts that are too hard. Bear in mind that if knowledge is as big a driver as reading, that text can become easier not just by moving up in topic. And if you stay within topic, you then get that interbuilding of words and concepts and language. Alligator is no longer a big fat 4-letter word. It's a topic and it's easy to read. And now I can learn about the ecology and environments of alligators.
Terrific. I think we're out of time, more than out of time. Am I right about that? Yes? Yes? Okay. So, well, thank you for your patience. And I just want to say you all have given us a very clear prescription. And now it is up to us to follow it. So I want to thank the panel and very much.
Thank you very, very much, of course, to you, Sue, and to our panel. And in closing, for this half of the session, I want to harken back to one of our questions and comments around how the attitudes of teachers and adults do affect our children's performances. And so while I think it's important to look at what is happening, ask yourself, what would happen if the child in front of you knew you already believed in his or her potential and already actually expected them to be able to read that book or pass that test? Ask any teacher that you know about the spark, and they will then just wax poetic. And I also heard comments about context and being familiar. Yes, we know how children do. They are cost-benefit analysis geniuses, and they will take to what they are very, very interested in. I see my colleague here, the president and CEO of the American Alliance of Museums, and we had the question about what about everything else that's happening outside of school. And so all of those things can help us in this space. So we are going to break for lunch and email and those kinds of things, and we will reconvene at 1 p.m. For those who are here with us and staying in this area, there's a food court in this building, and we also have a room set up to the right where folks can check their email, and we have email access. When we come back in the afternoon, we will be looking at the NAEP results for the Trial Urban District Assessment, and we're going to have another set of amazing panelists to talk through and about what is happening in some of our nation's largest cities. So I look forward to seeing you all at 1 p.m. Thank you.